Hi there, YouTube. The reason for today's video is because so many people have asked me how exactly I came to be an atheist. Since atheism is without a doubt the most rational and sane realization that I've ever had, particularly as it relates to my religious experience, I thought it might be helpful to walk you through my totally exhausting search for God upon leaving the Jehovah's Witnesses. See, at one time, I really wanted to be a believer. I mean, that tends to happen when you're raised in a fundamentalist household where there's absolute certainty that God exists. As you know, I was raised Jehovah's Witness from birth. On my dad's side, I'm third generation, meaning that my grandmother responded to a knock at the door one day. My dad grew up Jehovah's Witness, and therefore so did I. And on my mom's side, I'm actually fourth generation, meaning my great-grandparents answered the door. My grandmother became a Jehovah's Witness, though she was not technically raised in it. She came in as a teenager. But she sure as hell raised her kids in it with a vengeance. And you probably already know that my mother doubled down on that vengeance when raising me and my sister. The funny thing is that the Witnesses are responsible for calamity in my family going back generations. So my great-grandfather apparently brought a young lady into the truth in the rural area where they all lived. And long story short, her family disowned her. Now, I'm not entirely sure that this was because she became a Jehovah's Witness. He felt sorry for her, at least that's how the story goes, so he married her. Even though she was very young, I'm thinking maybe 17, 18, and he was not very young at all. He subsequently died and left the farmland that had been in our family for over 100 years to this young lady by default, who promptly kicked the entire family off the land and sold it off. Most of it. She broke it in pieces and sold it off. So years and years later, when my mother was in her 40s, she actually bought back the last 20 acres of our family farm back from this woman. Anyway, yeah, Witnesses started wreaking havoc way back in the day for my family. So you already know a good bit of my witness history by now if you've watched my videos. So when I left, I had a lot of very serious doubts. I mean, for the most part, I was convinced that they were not the one true religion. But at that point, I still thought there might actually be one somewhere. So my first experience with regular church was a worldly boyfriend of mine invited me to see one of his favorite musicians, which this guy wasn't particularly religious, so I don't really understand this. But this just happened to be a gospel singer by the name of Quentin Mills, a fact which I did not find out until we arrived at the Pentecostal Holiness Church. Now, since this was my actual first church experience and my first altar call, I'll say that there was an emotional moment there. I mean, I did feel something. I went down to the altar with my boyfriend, and a strange thing happened. So there were about 5 or 6 old men who just converged on me, just from different directions, and they all were praying and shouting, and then they started laying hands on me. I was not prepared for that, and it was not a pleasant experience in the least. So needless to say, I noped out of there pretty quick. Like, no, I'm gone. Bye-bye. But fast forward a bit, and many of my first group of worldly friends who I actually met in high school were very into goth subculture, which was kind of the thing at the time. Suffice it to say that I was the world's worst goth. It was just silly. There were a number of them who were really into Wicca and paganism. Was I into it? I mean, like, they were interested in it, not that they knew a lot about it. There was another boy who claimed that he could astral project himself. That's what he said, astral project. And that he could overhear conversations that were happening at the mall between other friends, even though he wasn't actually there. Now, I always thought when he would tell these stories that, you know, if I could do astral projection, I think I'd probably go somewhere besides a boring podunk mall in South Carolina. So I started reading a little bit about Wicca and witchcraft, seeing as how I'd already been accused of being a witch by my judicial committee, and I didn't yet know about my migraine situation, so there were the auras to contend with. So in case you missed it, in a previous video, I think it was my first one, I talked about the fact that the prominent issue in my judicial committee with the Jehovah's Witnesses, where I was disfellowshipped, was the fact that I saw auras. And the long and short of the story is that later, after I was disfellowshipped for about a year, I found out that what I had was not, in fact, demons or witchcraft. It was scintillating scotoma, which is otherwise known as visual or ocular migraines. And it was successfully treated. I didn't know that at this time, though. Suffice it to say that I considered the idea that maybe they were right, and maybe the universe was telling me that I should be a witch. Okay, I wanted to believe in something. But in my reading, I saw that many of my friends were pretty much completely ignorant of this religion that they were claiming to follow. But if the witnesses were so afraid of it, maybe there was something to it. So fast forward a little further, and I started studying Wicca in the same methodical, dogged way that I do pretty much everything. And I met another friend who really got into Wicca, and she, her husband, and I actually worked together for a little while. But it started to get really stupid to me. I mean, first of all, every single person in the pagan community where I lived was in it for one reason, and one reason only: to get laid. That was it. That was all, including my friends. And I was not about to sleep with any of them. There was this one couple that used to come to a local poetry reading group, and the guy looked like Charles Manson, and he called himself Lord something or other. I don't remember what he went by, but sometimes he would just randomly stand up in the middle of poetry reading and start casting a circle in the coffee shop. And this was not a Starbucks, y'all. This was a mom and pop coffee place in a very small town in South Carolina. Well, his paramour went by Lady Rhea, but she spelled it wrong. She spelled it R-E-H-A, which is Reha. Anyway, these two were always on about how they were the most powerful witches in the world and all of this power that they supposedly had, but they lived in a rundown single wide, and they were wearing the same thing every time I saw them. Anyway, the couple who were my friends that I was kind of practicing with started getting likewise weird. She built an altar in the foyer of her trailer. Yes, her trailer had a foyer, don't ask. So this altar was built out of concrete blocks and 2x4s, and on it she had some turkey feathers and a few rocks and some herbs from the spice rack, and her magic wand, which is what ultimately ended my foray into Wicca. At this point, I'd already been thinking that Wicca was a lot of work, and for me, it amounted to just about the same thing that being a Jehovah's Witness had, which is pretty much nothing. I mean, it was something to do, but I just wasn't feeling it. So one day, I went over to my friend's house, and I walked in the door, and of course, the first thing you see when you walk in the door is the concrete and 2x4 altar with all the crap on it. And she started showing me her new magic wand, which was a wooden spoon from Walmart. So it's not even real wood. It's like this pressed wood stuff, plastic handle on it. And she had taken a wood burner and inscribed a pentagram on it. Now, I use the term pentagram loosely here because it was actually a Star of David. And I couldn't help it. I just couldn't stop laughing. And I tried to explain, and she was so mad, and I laughed until I cried, and then I tried to stop laughing, and I laughed. It was so bad. That was the end of my Wicca and paganism. It's too bad, really. So after that, my then mother-in-law convinced me and my then husband to join her church, which happened to be the Church of God. Now, mainly, they needed someone to run the soundboard at the church, and my ex-husband sort of knew how to do that, so we went regularly for about a year, until one day, during the Sunday sermon, the preacher was talking about how he needed a man to stand with him for some reason or other, and I don't really remember why. And none of the men in the congregation shouted amen or stood up. And finally, this lady did. This lady stood up. And the preacher said, "Oh, that's all right, sister. You can stand behind me, but I need a man to stand beside me." And I just got up and walked out and never came back. I had to complete my infamous 6 credit hours of religion for my undergraduate degree at the Southern Baptist affiliated college that I went to. And as part of the Bible history class, I had to attend a certain number of different religious services. So there was a fledgling church that had just started that was meeting on campus, and I chose that one as one of the ones that I would go to. And it so happens that my first marriage was in the middle of falling apart at the time, mainly because my ex-husband was a cheating, immature son of a bitch, but that is not the point here. I went to this new church and I absolutely got hooked. I got saved, and I started going to the church every time the doors were open. I volunteered for things. I got baptized again. I mean, I really drank the Kool-Aid there for a little while because it was one of these new churches. The people had tattoos and piercings, and they talked about, you know, real things. And it distracted me from the divorce I was going through, and it helped me concentrate on something besides my own misery, which was useful, I guess. You know, after a while, I kind of started having problems with it. And a while after, you know, initiating the divorce proceedings and all that, I very briefly dated a guy who was really, really into this same church. And while I was going there, I saw the place really grow from a fledgling ministry to a megachurch. I mean, it is a megachurch now. And I realized later it's a mega cult, actually. So I got sucked right into another one. This guy that I went on a couple dates with, he's a real winner, let me tell you. He hit on the waitress while we were out at dinner, and he asked me for advice on asking another girl out while we were on a date. I mean, he was utterly clueless. Or maybe he was just an asshole. The guy was dumb as a box of hair, really. Who is that? What are you doing?
Me and the
It's you. So, are you going to be on one of our dates? We went to an event that my current husband, who I didn't know at the time, actually was organizing, and that's where I met him. So he and I kind of hit it off. We became friends. One evening, we were supposed to meet up with a larger group of people to go to a concert. And I actually could not afford to go to the restaurant that they were meeting at because I was very poor at the time. I said, I just can't go. He said, well, why don't you just come over to my house? We'll eat something here, and then we'll go over and meet everybody else at the concert because I really wanted to go to the concert. I said, okay. Well, I'm expecting bologna sandwiches or something. So I get there, and everything matches. It's clean. He is cooking. And by cooking, I mean he's actually making his own pasta sauce. I kid you not. I mean, even his dogs matched. It was amazing. So I'm sitting there thinking, like, is he gay? Because he's awesome. Well, we ate dinner, and then we went to the concert, and the rest of the group ditched us. Finally, one of them texted and said, oh, we're going to some party instead. But that was fun, because Les and I had the time of our lives. So by the end of the evening, he looks at me and he goes, you know, we should do this again. And I said, well, only if we don't invite those guys. What, sweetheart? Here we are now. We're 14 years later, almost 15 years later. And we have this guy, and you have met Harrison. So this man was the first person who ever actually listened to me. I mean, even about little things. Because, for example, the next time that I went over to his house, he had my favorite coffee and cream. I didn't even remember that we talked about it, but we did. You know, he's never been one for words. I don't hear a lot of compliments. I don't hear a lot of, you know, hey, baby from him. But the thing is that actions do speak louder than words. And his actions speak louder than any words I've ever heard in the Kingdom Hall or the church. And believe it or not, this is actually relevant to my story. So, back to church. I was at the megachurch, really into it, even though I did have a few problems with it. I mean, people were very gossipy. They were not very kind. Sometimes it actually felt a little bit like middle school, much like the Kingdom Hall did at times. And the pastor sometimes would slip up and say some pretty bad things from the pulpit. A couple of times I heard the N-word or the F-word referring to gay people, which is kind of a deal breaker for me, both of those. And I tried to justify it to myself by saying, well, look where we are in the South and how everybody's been raised, but I had a hard time with that because it just did not sit well with me. And, of course, the fundamental questions that I'd had ever since childhood about Christianity and the very existence of God were still kind of nagging back there in my mind. They didn't go away. I was just trying to kill them. Like, I don't want to think about this anymore. Plus, there were 2 semesters of Bible history under my belt that convinced me that what they said about the Bible, both in the Kingdom Hall and in this megachurch, was just not true. I mean, there was no way, no possible way that the Bible was the infallible Word of God. The thing was, I just really wanted to believe, and I was trying really hard to believe. So then one Sunday, the inevitable happened. I was on the prayer team at this megachurch, which is a group of people who meet in the backstage area of the church and pray constantly throughout the whole service. So there's multiple services. So you would go and you would listen to one, and then you would go backstage and you would pray all the way through the next one, which was just a repeat of the first one because you'd have a full house like 3 or 4 times a Sunday. There was this lady who was on prayer team with me, and she decided one day that it was her business to inquire whether I was dating anyone since I was divorced. And I said, well, yeah, I recently started dating someone new. She asked me, well, does he go to church here? And I said, no, he doesn't. And y'all, this woman went completely apeshit on me. Keep in mind, I was 27 years old by this point. I had been out of the Jehovah's Witnesses for 7 of those years. There was still some of the indoctrination there, but there was also a whole lot of angry. And when she looked at me and said, I'll bet you are already sleeping with him. And he can't be Christ-like if he doesn't go to this church. And you are unclean before God if you are having sex outside of marriage. And that's when I snapped. In front of the entire prayer team, they probably heard me out in the auditorium. I'm just saying. I said, look, lady. My relationship status and what may or may not happen in my bedroom is none of your goddamn business. And furthermore, that heathen of a man that you're talking about is more like Jesus than any of the posers in this building, up to and including the one preaching on the stage right now. And if I had wanted your opinion on my personal life, I would have fucking asked for it. And once again, I walked out and never went back. Well, I did a lot of reading. I lived life. And then one day, I came across the work of Richard Dawkins, which led to Sam Harris and Christopher Hitchens. And I read and read and read and watched YouTube videos, and it was almost like this mental homecoming. Like, wow, y'all, the truth does exist, and it's so much simpler than I thought it was. It doesn't require mental gymnastics. It just is. I mean, this was like my first epiphany moment in high school English class that I talked about in a previous video. It felt like I was finally okay. Except this time, that feeling stuck with me. I don't need to believe in a God or follow a religion to be moral and to be good. In fact, can actually be more moral without any of that, for the simple fact that when an atheist does a good deed, they do it because it's the right thing to do. It's not because they want a reward from God or because they fear punishment in hell. We just do it because it's the right thing to do. And further, we are free to enjoy life without the obligation to feel guilty for not worshiping some angry, vindictive, childish, ineffectual deity. I mean, we're free to decide for ourselves what we want to read, watch, listen to, who we spend time with, who we love, who and what to avoid. And then there's a flip side to that too, which is the personal responsibility that comes with being an atheist. Because it's real. It's a thing. See, I can't blame the devil when I screw up anymore. I can't credit God taking care of me for coincidences or whatever. I mean, what I've done or not done is on me. And what happens to me or doesn't happen to me is just a coincidence. So, is atheism the be-all, end-all happiness bullet? Well, no, of course it isn't. Because there isn't one. All life is ups and downs and changes. But I can definitely say that I'm a lot happier since I realized that I'm just an atheist. I kind of always have been. And for bonus points, death is not really that scary of a concept anymore. I used to be very afraid of it as a Jehovah's Witness and as a religious person. But as my oldest son, who you saw earlier, once said, it's just not scary if everybody does it. So that's my religious history in a nutshell. I mean, I kind of stumbled around in the dark for a while, but I eventually figured it out. And so will you, whether you ultimately end up a believer or not.